This is the second video of the MERN app security series. If you haven't watched the first video where we have discussed content security policy, I will be linking the complete playlist in the description below. Feel free to check it out. The topic of this video is authentication and authorization, and we will be implementing token-based authentication in our app using a JWT token. In this video, we will be creating 3 pages: register, login, and a protected page. So what we will be doing is we will be creating our user model in our database. We will be able to register new users in our database from our UI. We will implement a token-based authentication on login, and then we will be implementing protected routes that can only be accessed by the authenticated user. Now, before we jump to code, let's just understand what authentication and authorization means. Authentication is the process of identifying a user that is accessing a system, whereas authorization is a mechanism of granting permission to the user for accessing particular resources and functions. Let me explain it to you with an analogy. Let's suppose you are at the door of your friend's house. The fact that you just by your face can enter this house is kind of authentication, as you cannot enter any other house in the locality with just your face. So your face acts as a credential here, and you can enter this system. Similarly for your friend as well, his face also acts as a credentials for his own house, and he can enter it. So this was authentication, where the system is your friend's house and you and your friend are users who can enter this system. Now in the same example, let's understand authorization. So in your friend's house, you will have authority to some extent. You just cannot do anything you want. On the other hand, your friend has kind of an admin access there, and he can do whatever he wants to do there. So both you and your friend are in the same system but at different access levels. Similarly, in web systems like Instagram, you can log in with your credentials, and this is the part of authentication. But the fact that you can only see what is posted on your friend's account and not delete it is the part of authorization to some extent. Now enough of the talk, let's just jump into the code and start building. I will be explaining different concepts as they come along. Let's begin. Okay, so now here we will start from where we left in the last video. As you can see on my screen, this was the part where we implemented the content security policy, and if you see in the code, then we will get our simple app.js, where we have the given the image that is coming from the Unsplash, and in our content security policy page inside our server, we have defined image source that is specifically coming from the Unsplash, and any other source will give content security policy violation as here. Now before we start, let's just install some of the dependencies in our server. I will be installing them one by one and will be explaining what is the use of each one of them, but you can install them together. I will also be explaining the use of each one of these dependencies so that you can better understand. So the first dependencies that we will be installing is CORS. Now let's understand what is CORS. So CORS stand for Cross Origin Resource Sharing. You can read more about it on articles like these. One of these from Geeks for Geeks I will be sharing in the description, or you can just search CORS npm or CORS node and you will get the documents like these to read. I will be explaining for our specific case. Okay, so let me just go to our code. So currently what we are doing is we have the build folder in our client, and we are using this build folder with our server application, and we are putting the HTML part or the client part into our server, and then we are running it and getting our UI on the server. And this is how we are able to run our client on our server port, which is 5001. As you can see here. So web browsers essentially don't allow a request from the other site on the site that is loaded. So in our case, since the CORS is not implemented currently, so the server cannot be hit by the client as of now. That is why we are passing the build folder to our server, which is not an efficient way to do this. So we will be using CORS so that we can host our client at port 3000 or some other port, and we can have our server at port 5001 or any other port of our choice, and we can hit the server by the client. So this was about CORS. You can read more about it over the internet, and we will be implementing this in our project in some time. Next in the line is .env. Let's install it. Now in our server folder, we will be installing .env. Okay, so now let us understand what .env does. Whenever we are working on a project, many of the variables that we use are sometimes specific to a certain environment. These variables are called environment variables and are stored in a .env file. Some of the examples of environment variables are your API keys, database URLs for your database connection, relative paths to some of the files that are being used in your project, etc. We will be learning about some more environment variables as we move forward. Now let's just download our next dependency. Our next dependency is bcrypt. Now let's just install it. Let's understand what bcrypt does. You can learn about bcrypt.js in this npm page, and we will be using bcrypt for storing our password into our database. We will be encrypting the password using bcrypt and we will be storing into database. In many of the cases where security is concerned, most of the data is stored in an encrypted fashion into our database. So we will be seeing a part of this using the bcrypt.js library. Now let's just install our next dependency. So our next dependency will be Mongoose. Let's install Mongoose. So Mongoose is a package that will help us to establish a connection with our MongoDB database. Now let's just jump to our next dependency, which is the main dependency of this video, JSON Web Token. Let's install JSON Web Token. Now let's understand how a token-based authentication system works. The user will enter the login credentials in the client. Then these credentials will be transferred to the authentication server, and authentication server will provide us with the token. This token is then sent to the resource server, and the resource server will then provide us the resources that we need. This was the case of authentication, but the authorization part also works similar. For the authorization part, the things are similar. It's just that we will be sending different resources to the two different users as per their access levels, as you can see in this image. Now, since we have installed all the dependencies, we can proceed further in our project. Now we will be creating different directories in our server as per our project needs. So let's proceed further. The directories in our server that we will be needing are controllers, middleware, models, and routes. As you can see in our server folder, we have created the following directories: controller, middleware, models, and routes. Now let's just come back to our server file and start implementing the changes. Now let me zoom the screen a little bit so that we are able to see the changes. Let's start implementing. We will begin by implementing CORS. So let's just import it first. So for course, we don't have to do much. We have to just use it in our app, and then we will be good to go. App.use course. That's it. So basically, we have enabled course in our Node.js project here. Now, since course is implemented, let's just delete the previous implementation where we were using the build folder in our server to show the UI. Yeah, so here it is. So we will just delete this complete part, or we can just comment it so that you can use it for future references. So I've just commented it here, and we are good to go for our next part. So next in the line is Mongoose. We will be using Mongoose to connect our database with our Node.js project. So let's first import Mongoose. So to connect our MongoDB database, we must have a Mongo URI to connect to it. So here you can use MongoDB Atlas. This will provide you a cloud-based collection that you will be using. For implementation, you can see this video. For this project, I am using MongoDB locally. So make sure that MongoDB service is up and running on your local machine. For running MongoDB service on Mac, you can see this video. For running MongoDB on Windows, you can see this video. I have provided all the links in the description. Now, since I already have my MongoDB service up and running with me here, I will just take this URI with me and will connect my database. And for this URI, for now we will just paste it here. Now we will try to connect with our database using this MongoDB URI, mongoose.connect, mongoose.connect. This will have two arguments. First, our database URI, which will be a string, and second, an object that has different usage parameters. For now, we will be using two of them, which are these. For now, we will be using these two parameters, use URL parcel and use unified topology. And after then we will be having a dot then, and here we will be passing a function that just simply console logs our message, console dot log MongoDB connected. Also, in case of any error, we will also add a catch, error console dot log error. Now, before moving further, as you can see, we have many environment variables like port here and Mongo URI here. Let's just put them into .env file and link it here, and then we will run the server now. Let's just create a new .env file in our server. Here we will define our port as 5001 will be equal to here, and we will also add our Mongo URI. Now we will link these two in our server file. Let's just add here .env.config. And now let's just use those values. So here we will have process.env.mongo URI. Similarly, for port we will have process.env.port. Okay, so one thing is left here, that is we did not import the .env. So import .env from .env. And also here I must have only .env. Yes. Okay, so now since we have made all the changes, let's just run our server. And okay, so here we are getting some warnings that in newer versions of Node we don't need these two, so let's just skip them. And also, since we are using a newer version of Node, there is one more challenge. In versions of Node after Node 14, this mapping of local host is not working, so we will have to replace it with 0.0.0.0, and here we will add one this. Okay, so now let's just run our server again. And as you can see here, now MongoDB is connected. Since our server and database are connected now, let's start with making our user model. So earlier we created these controller middleware models and route folders. So in the model folder, we will be creating a new file. Let's call it users.js. So I have a basic template for the user model and we will be using this. Now in our controller, we will be making functions for register and login. Here we are following a simple model controller view architecture. You can read more about it if you want. Now in our controller, let's create a new file. Let's name it auth controller. Now let's first import the user model that we have created. Now here we will be requiring two asynchronous functions, namely register and login. This will have two arguments, let's say request and response. Oh, I mistyped this. And similarly for login also. Now we will spread the name, email and password with the request body. Now one more requirement that we will naturally have is the email should be unique of a newly registered user. So let's implement that part also. The MongoDB schema provides us with methods like find one that we will be using to implement this. Let's first add a try catch block. Now let us declare a user and check if the email is unique or not. User.find1. The unique property we want is email. Now if we get a match here, we will simply return an error message in the response like this, that the user is already existing. Else we will be creating our new user object with the request data. Now if here you can see, we will be using the same password that we are getting from the request body, which is not a right way to do this. So we will be encrypting it by using the bcrypt library that we have discussed earlier. So let's just import bcrypt. And now we will perform the encryption by these two lines. Now here we are firstly generating a salt and then encrypting our password with that salt. This salt is basically adding a random string with our password so that it is difficult for any hacker to decrypt it. Suppose in the case where two people have same password, this random salt generated will be completely different for those people. As a result, the encrypted password will be different, even for the same password. And this 10 here is simply a weightage parameter. The greater the value, the more complex the hash you will get. Now, since we have encrypted our password, we can now save the new user. Now at the last, we will be generating our JWT token and sending it as a response after the user registration. Whenever we create a new document in a MongoDB collection, a unique ID field is automatically generated with it. So we will be using this ID to create our payload that will be passed as an argument for generating the JWT token. Let me just pull up the code and show you. As you can see here, we are creating a payload variable with our id as user.id, and we will be passing it to the jwt.sign function to generate a JWT token for this particular ID. Here also we are passing a string to perform hashing functions, and in the end, if everything is successful, then we are sending our token as a response. Let's just import the JWT here. Also in our environment file, let's declare the JWT secret. Let's say we give it password 123. Similarly, like register, we will also be creating our login function inside our controller. One more thing, for error handling, we will be just sending our exceptions as server error. Now let's complete our login function. So as you can see here, we are identifying the user with its email, and if the user exists, then we are also matching the password by using bycrypt and user.password, and we are comparing both of them to check the credentials. And similar to as we have discussed just now, we will be sending a JWT token on successful login as a response. So this auth controller was the main crux of this video. Now let's just quickly finish by creating routes and integrating our UI with this. Now at this point we will have 3 routes, 2 public and 1 protected. The public route will be the login and register pages, and the protected route will be our page that we created earlier. Now inside our routes folder, let's just create auth.js for having our public routes. Here we will be consuming the functions that we created earlier for login and register. And we will be also be creating a protected route. So before creating the protected route, we will be creating a middleware function that will basically match the token of the logged in user and grant him or her access of the protected route. So as you can see here, we are checking if the token exists or in the request header or not. And if the token does not exist, then we are just simply sending that no token and authorization denied. Okay, so in the second part, we are verifying that if the token exists, then the user's token is same as the token that we are getting from the request. Now we will be using this auth function into our protected route. For that, in our root folder, let's just create a new file, protected.js. As you can see here, we have defined a protected route at path API/protected, and this auth function ensures that only an authenticated user will be able to access this protected route. Now we will be integrating all this in our server file, and we'll jump to UI part. So now let's jump to our server.js and put our routes here. Now all the changes in the backend are done. Now let's just modify our UI and see the result. Okay, so now let's continue with the UI part. To start with, we will be creating auth context inside our UI so that our auth variables are accessible everywhere in our React code base. So in source, let's create a new folder called context. In this folder, we will be creating a new file called auth context. Inside auth context, we will be creating our auth provider as shown here. Now in the app.js, we will be wrapping the whole UI with this auth provider. Now let's create our register and login component and hit the APIs that we have created earlier. So this is our register component where we are taking name, email and password as input from the user, and we are hitting our register API with that data. So due to the time constraints, I am also copying the CSS as well for this, and I will be providing the GitHub repo for this in the description. Similarly, we will be creating the login component as well. Here also we are hitting the login API that we have created earlier. And to manage data on UI, we are using the auth context that we used earlier. And on successful login, we are navigating to the protected page. Now let us create a protected page. It is same as the home page that we created earlier, hello world. Okay, so this data is same as the home page that we had. So we will have remove this from our app.js. In app.js, we will be handling the routing part. Before that, let's just create our protected route. Here we are only navigating if the token exists. Now let's import all of this in our app.js and create routes. Also for routing, we will have to use some dependencies from the React router DOM. Now we are creating routes as per our use case. So here as you can see, we have two public routes, register and login, and one protected route which is protected, and we are passing protected page inside our protected route. Cool, now our coding part is done. Now let's just run the client and server and see our output. Okay, so our client is running at localhost 3000. Let's run our server again. Okay, so we have missed the imports for the routes. Let's add them. So these imports were missing, and we will just remove the file URL to path import and run the server again. Okay, so in many of the places I have used import as controllers instead of controller, or routes instead, or routes instead of root. So you can just fix it if you face the same error. I have fixed them. And now let's just run our server. Okay, now server is running, client is running. Let's see the output. So here if you will see, since we don't have anything on our home page in app.js, so we are seeing a blank page. But when you open a register page, we will be able to see our registration page here. Now let's add some data. User 345. Let's give this email user345@gmail, and password will be user 345. Before we hit register, let's just inspect and see one thing. Now let's just hit register. As you can see, we are getting a successful post call, and in response we are getting our token. Now with the same credentials, if I hit again, I will get an error with the message user already exists. In our MongoDB database also, if we see in test and users, here we will see our new user as user 345 with the details we have provided. And if you see here, we have the encrypted password sent in our database as we discussed earlier. Now let's try to log in with this same user. Okay, so we are able to log in, and we see the page that we saw earlier at our home route. And here also in response, if you see, we get the JWT token. One more thing, we can decode this JWT token with some online tools available. Let's try this. Now, if I paste the JWT token here, we will get the user ID that we have sent in the payload like done earlier. And in database also, you can match 6670, 66D70, similar to this F12 at the F12 at the, yeah. So we can easily decode the JWT token using these online tools. And the token itself is divided into three parts. The first part is header. It tells the type of the token and the algorithm it is using for hashing. Second is our payload that we have created earlier, and start and expiration time that we have provided of 1 hour, and a signature in the end. So this was the implementation of authentication and authorization. Hope you like this video. If you learned anything new in this video, please subscribe to the channel. Also in next video, we will be discussing about validations and input sanitization. So stay tuned for it. Thank you.